Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our final segment of today's show, we're talking about the shocking news coming from the Jets camp that they are hiring Aaron Glenn as their 21st head coach. But it really isn't shocking, in my opinion. I think this is a great hire for the Jets, first and foremost, especially on the defensive side of the football. Has a lot of weapons to utilize in that regard, but it certainly comes with its caveats. Obviously, the ownership, really a mess. The quarterback situation, an even bigger mess. And ultimately, hiring another defensive-minded coach could rub a lot of Jets fans the wrong way if he doesn't get a couple things right. But I do think that this is the right guy for the job if you look at how potentially the Jets might want to build in terms of their philosophies, because I do think that their defensive unit is the way to build this team from the bottom up. So let's assess the impact this has on both the Jets and the Lions as well. But first, let's talk about how Aaron Glenn reunites with his former team. Yes, he was a former New York Jet. He was a first-round pick for them in 1994 out of Texas A&M. He spent 8 seasons with them, made 2 Pro Bowls, left them after those 8 seasons, had a prolific career as well. I believe it was a Houston Texan. I'm not necessarily certain where he went after New York, but was a former Jet, so this is interesting to see him reunite with his former team. Obviously, could have a lot of good relations within the front office there as well, but I truly do believe that looking at all the options the Jets had available to them and seeing as to how, they're taking advantage of the Lions' surprising loss in the divisional round, that this was the right move for them. Because before, with Saleh, he had built a reputation, but I'm not necessarily certain he was expecting, or the Jets were expecting, this whole Rodgers saga to play out like this. Now, Aaron Glenn is stepping into a situation where at least he knows how uncertain the quarterback position, the future of it is, and he can assess and analyze it from that perspective rather than Robert Saleh getting tossed into the fire with Aaron Rodgers. So I do think this will have a very positive impact in terms of how a first-year head coach can analyze this rather than someone who's been there for as long as Robert Saleh was. But I do think that first and foremost, when we talk about Aaron Glenn, we have to talk about how he's revamping this defense. So, obviously, he spent many years as an assistant in NFL circles before he became the Lions defensive coordinator in 2021. But immediately, as soon as he came into the Lions situation, he implemented his physical man-to-man style, and they saw very quick results. The Lions had the second lowest completion percentage in his time there, lowest passer rating allowed in his time there as well. So as you can see, he got results out of a defense that was able to build through the draft, most importantly, which is a good thing considering that the Jets are going to have to answer a lot of questions through the draft this year as well. But ultimately, proving that a quick turnaround in terms of your philosophy could pay dividends for you. And so that's what's so exciting about Aaron Glenn implementing his ideas with this squad, especially with the players they have. You have Quinn Williams up front. You have Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed in your secondary. And then you have the 7th overall pick in this year's draft, where you could pick anyone that you need for this team that you want to build through your defense. But then again, the big question for Aaron Glenn is not what he's going to do with this defense, because I think he's going to do wonders for this defense. It's how he's going to hire his staff for the offense. It's how he's going to think about this draft pick in terms of whether or not he should go offense or defense. And most importantly, how he solves the QB situation that will have an impact on how the Jets improve. Because remember, the Jets were 4-13 with Aaron Rodgers. And yes, a lot of people will place a lot of blame on him, but look at his stats. He had very similar stats to his last season in Green Bay, where he had over 3,000 yards, he had over 25 touchdowns, and only 11 or so interceptions. So he didn't play terribly. But you still have to consider all the options. You have to consider Aaron Rodgers' status on this team and what he's feeling. It's a lot to navigate if you're a defensive-minded coach, and especially if you're a defensive-minded first-year head coach, as Aaron Glenn is. But I do think that when we look at all the questions that are going to be asked of Aaron Glenn, I do think that the draft is going to answer a lot of them, because how he views the draft and how this Jets organization views the draft is going to be very, very intriguing. Because at number 7 overall, you're not in line to get one of the top 2 quarterbacks, a couple stellar defensive players that you might want to look at will be out the board as well, and you're not necessarily in position to reach for a guy or take at best position of biggest need if you're the Jets. But obviously, they have very big questions offensively, more so than defensively, in my opinion. But when you look at all those mock drafts, it is a weird pick to determine, just because you also have a lot of defensive players who could really supplement what Aaron Glenn wants to do. You have a lot of nice safeties. Malachi Starks could be an option, but he could be seen as a reach. Nick Emenwari could be a bit of a reach, but he could be someone who's nice in terms of the coverage that Aaron Glenn wants to employ. But when I think about the ways you can answer this question, if you're Aaron Glenn and people are asking you about what are you going to do with this draft pick that's in a weird spot, say you're going to pick offense, because offense is where you also need to build from. And one of the biggest question marks for the Jets heading into this offseason is how they're going to address this offensive line. They have a lot of nice pieces in place. They signed Moses and Tyron Smith in the offseason, didn't play terribly well, but still nice tackles to have. They drafted Olu Fashanu, who I actually think had a pretty decent season for what he was given with the situation he was put into. And then you have an offensive line class that's pretty deep at the top. You potentially have your pick of 2 of the best tackles in the class in Will Campbell and Calvin Banks, and you would answer a lot of questions in terms of how you rebuild this offense by drafting one of them. So if I'm Aaron Glenn, I have in the back of my mind some guys I want at the defensive positions that I might want to look into a little bit more and bolster. But I also have in the back of my mind how to rebuild this offense, and furthermore, entrust in my team, instill in my team the confidence that it can be rebuilt, especially if Aaron Rodgers decides to return. If not, then I do think that it's going to be interesting to see the latter stages of the draft for the Jets. Because if, say, Aaron Rodgers does leave, it leaves you with a pretty weird, complicated spot. Because if you're drafting a quarterback in the latter stages of the draft, you're definitely not going to get a day one starter, in my opinion. You're not going to get a day one starter out of Quinn Ewers, Dylan Gabriel, Jackson Dart, what have you. I feel like you might want to, with your first overall pick, deliver a statement of intent for this offense and drafting either Banks or Campbell if they're still there, or one of the other good tackles in this class. But I do think that in order to really hammer home the fact that Aaron Rodgers could be seen as a bridge starter, and then you develop a guy like Ewers, Gabriel, Darter, what have you, after you draft them, you need to ensure that your 7th overall pick is a good one for Rodgers at the very least. Because that's what I think Rodgers wants from that 7th overall pick. He wants a bookend tackle who he can rely on to protect him. He wants to build this offense. But this decision to hire Aaron Glenn puts that draft pick in question, in my opinion, just because of how he could build this defense. And looking at this defense, it would be nice to have a running partner on the edge for a guy like Quinnen Williams, so he's not going to have to really make hay through the interior. And then on the back end, you have good corners, but you might want a safety who can do well in run support, do well in man-to-man once Aaron Glenn employs that system. So it's going to be an interesting ride to see how the Jets handle this offseason. But ultimately, seeing as to how Aaron Glenn is someone who can get immediate success out of his teams, I wouldn't be too worried if I'm a Jets fan about how he views the draft, because either way, whether it's offense or defense, you know it's a good building block for the future, because if it's offense, it proves that Aaron Glenn's not going to overlook that side of the football. And if it's defense, you know that it's only going to get even better than it already is. So, no matter what happens this offseason with the Jets, no matter what rumors arise, I think they're in a better spot now that Aaron Glenn's their head coach rather than anyone else, because he has a chance to firmly assess this team and where they are and then make decisions. And that's something that can't be said for a lot of these Jets coaches who are thrown into the fire. And the fact that he was a former Jet really gives him that level of respect potentially in the locker room as well. So I think that it's at least in the A to B tier higher in terms of how I would grade it out, just because of what I think he can do with this defense. It's going to be really fun to see what he does. But ultimately, you can't go wrong with someone who's a former Jet and who got immediate success in his biggest role with this team. But ultimately, that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow, as always, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Consider making yourselves available to, as always, the Super Chat, Super Things, and the Super Stickers features, and our website, GSMCpodcast.net. You can contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly. But other than that, I'm out for today. See y'all tomorrow to conclude the week.